Jonathan Roumie sat quietly at his corner table when the cafe manager approached with crossed arms and pointed directly at the simple cross hanging around his neck. "Sir, I need you to remove that religious symbol or leave immediately," she declared, loud enough for the entire busy cafe to hear. What happened next would shock every customer watching and transform this moment of religious discrimination into something no one saw coming. Least of all the manager, who thought she was simply enforcing policy. Jonathan's fingers instinctively moved to the cross at his throat, the same one he'd worn faithfully for years, a simple reminder of his deepest beliefs and the character he portrayed on screen. The manager, a woman in her 40s with platinum blonde hair, pulled back severely, crossed her arms and waited for his response. Behind her, a young barista with worried eyes clutched a coffee pot, clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding scene. "I'm not sure I understand," Jonathan said quietly, his voice carrying that familiar, gentle tone that had comforted millions of viewers worldwide. He remained seated, making no move to be confrontational or demanding. The manager's expression hardened slightly, as if she'd expected anger or indignation rather than this calm, measured response from the actor known for portraying Jesus Christ. The cafe had been Jonathan's refuge for the past hour, a quiet place to review scripts and answer emails between filming sessions for The Chosen. He'd ordered nothing more than black coffee and had been sitting peacefully in the corner, bothering no one. The decision to stop here, instead of his usual coffee shop, had been spontaneous, prompted by a desire to explore a different part of downtown Los Angeles. 3 months earlier, Jonathan had been walking through this same neighborhood after visiting a local shelter where he volunteered. The cafe hadn't been open yet, still under renovation with workers moving in and out. A small sign in the window had announced Cornerstone Cafe opening soon, a space for everyone. The irony of that slogan wasn't lost on him now, as he sat facing discrimination. "Our establishment has a strict policy about religious displays," the manager, whose name tag read Linda, explained with crisp professionalism. "We pride ourselves on being a neutral space where all customers can feel comfortable regardless of their beliefs or backgrounds. Religious symbols can make some patrons feel excluded or unwelcome." Her tone suggested this wasn't the first time she'd delivered this speech. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully, processing her words. Around him, conversations had died to whispers, as other customers strained to hear the exchange. A young mother with 2 children glanced nervously between Jonathan and Linda, while an elderly gentleman at the counter shook his head disapprovingly. The barista, a college-aged girl with kind eyes, seemed to be fighting an internal battle about whether to intervene. "I appreciate you explaining your policy," Jonathan replied, his voice remaining steady and respectful, "but I'm curious. Would you ask someone to remove a Star of David or cover a crescent moon pendant?" He asked the question not with anger, but with genuine curiosity, as if he were simply trying to understand the logic behind the rule that was being applied to him. Linda's cheeks flushed slightly at the question, but she maintained her stance. Any religious symbol that might make other customers uncomfortable would be addressed consistently, she said, though her voice carried less conviction than before. Behind her, the young barista, whose name tag read Sarah, bit her lip nervously, clearly disagreeing with her manager's approach, but unsure how to voice her concerns. The silence stretched again, as Jonathan considered his options. He could simply remove the necklace, order his coffee, and leave quietly. He could argue and demand his rights as a customer. Or he could do something else entirely, something that might turn this moment of division into an opportunity for grace and understanding. His years of portraying Christ had taught him about the power of unexpected responses. From behind the counter, Sarah watched Jonathan's face, recognizing something in his expression that reminded her of someone she'd grown up watching The Chosen with her grandmother, finding comfort in the gentle portrayal of Jesus during her family's difficult times. Now seeing Jonathan in person, she realized who was sitting in their cafe, facing discrimination for the very symbol that represented his most meaningful work. "You know what?" Jonathan said finally, rising slowly from his chair. "I think I understand your position." Linda relaxed slightly, assuming he was preparing to leave or comply with her request. But Jonathan's next words surprised everyone in the cafe. "Would it be all right if I shared something with you? Not as someone trying to change your mind, but just as one person talking to another?" The question caught Linda off guard. She'd been prepared for anger, arguments, or threats to call corporate headquarters. She hadn't expected this calm request for dialogue. Something in Jonathan's demeanor, the absence of hostility or judgment, made her pause. "I suppose that would be all right," she said cautiously, glancing around at the customers who were now openly watching their interaction. Jonathan smiled gently, the same expression that had brought peace to countless viewers of The Chosen. "This cross," he said, touching the pendant lightly, "isn't about excluding anyone. For me, it's about love. The kind of love that includes everyone, especially those who feel different or unwelcome." His words carried no preaching tone, just simple honesty about what the symbol meant to him personally. Sarah stepped forward from behind the counter, her young face flushed with nervous determination. "My am," she said to Linda. I think this might be Jonathan Roumie." Linda's eyebrows shot up in confusion, but Sarah continued, "He plays Jesus in The Chosen, my grandmother, and I watch it together every week. He's actually really kind to everyone he meets." The revelation rippled through the cafe like a small wave. The elderly gentleman at the counter nodded knowingly. He'd recognized Jonathan from the beginning, but had remained silent. The young mother whispered something to her children, who looked at Jonathan with wide, curious eyes. Even Linda seemed taken aback, as if the actor's presence somehow complicated her straightforward policy enforcement. "I don't think his job changes anything," Linda said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "Policy is policy, regardless of who's involved." But even as she spoke, Jonathan could see uncertainty creeping into her expression. The confidence she displayed moments earlier was wavering, replaced by something that looked almost like regret. Jonathan raised his hand gently, a gesture that somehow commanded attention without demanding it. "You're absolutely right," he said to Linda, surprising her again. "My work doesn't entitle me to special treatment. Every person who walks through that door deserves the same respect and consideration, whether they're famous or completely unknown. That's actually something I believe very deeply." The young mother at the nearby table leaned forward slightly, drawn into the conversation despite herself. Her children, sensing the importance of the moment, had stopped fidgeting and were listening intently. The older child, perhaps 8 years old, tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered something that made her smile sadly. A question about why the nice man couldn't wear his necklace. Sarah found her courage growing as she watched Jonathan's patient response to Linda's rigid policy. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, using Linda's surname, "remember what you told me when I started working here about how the customer service motto was meet people where they are? Maybe this is one of those times." Her voice carried the earnestness of youth combined with genuine care for doing the right thing. "If you've ever needed courage to stand up for what's right, like Sarah did, comment the word courage below." Linda, Mrs. Patterson looked between Sarah and Jonathan, her internal struggle becoming more visible with each passing moment. The cafe's other customers were no longer pretending to mind their own business. They were openly invested in how this situation would resolve. The elderly gentleman at the counter had turned fully around, his weathered hands gripping his coffee cup. He waited to see what would happen next. "I appreciate what both of you are saying," Jonathan continued, his tone remaining gentle and understanding, "but I want you to know that I'm not upset about your policy. I'm actually grateful for this conversation because it's helping me understand something important: how symbols that bring comfort to some people can feel threatening to others." His response seemed to catch everyone off guard, including Linda. The unexpected grace in Jonathan's words created a shift in the room's atmosphere. Where tension had been building, something softer began to emerge. Linda's defensive posture relaxed slightly, and Sarah looked at Jonathan with growing admiration. Even the other customers seemed to lean in, as if sensing that they were witnessing something significant, a moment when conflict might transform into understanding. 2 tables away, an older woman who had been typing on her laptop closed it and spoke up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'm Dr. Martinez, and I teach comparative religion at UCLA. I've been listening to this conversation, and I have to say this young man is demonstrating exactly the kind of respect for different beliefs that we should all aspire to." Her intervention added a new dimension to the discussion. Dr. Martinez stood and approached their small group, her expression thoughtful. "In my 20 years of teaching, I've seen countless examples of how religious symbols can either build bridges or create walls. The difference isn't usually in the symbol itself, but in the heart and intention of the person wearing it. She looked meaningfully at Jonathan's cross. Jonathan nodded appreciatively at Dr. Martinez's words, then turned back to Linda with renewed focus. "You mentioned wanting all customers to feel welcome," he said. "That's a beautiful goal, and I respect that intention. But I wonder, could there be a way to achieve that welcome without asking people to hide the things that are most important to them?" The question hung in the air, challenging without condemning. Sarah seized the moment to speak again, her confidence growing. "Mrs. Patterson, we have customers who wear all kinds of jewelry and symbols. Yesterday, a woman had a pentagram pendant. And last week a man wore a kippah the whole time he was here. I thought the whole point was that everyone could be themselves in this space." Her observation was gentle, but pointed. Linda's resolve was clearly crumbling as the weight of inconsistency in her policy became apparent. Those situations were different, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The truth was becoming clear to everyone present. The cross necklace had been singled out in a way that other religious symbols hadn't been, and the unfairness of that treatment was becoming undeniable. The elderly gentleman at the counter finally spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of years. "Young lady," he said to Linda, "I've been coming to cafes for 60 years, and I've never seen someone asked to remove a cross necklace. I've seen people kicked out for being loud or rude, but never for wearing a symbol of faith. This doesn't sit right with me." His words carried moral authority that seemed to resonate with everyone present. Jonathan placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. "Thank you for speaking up," he said warmly. "But I want everyone to know that I'm not looking for people to take sides here. Mrs. Patterson is trying to do her job and create a welcoming environment. Sometimes, the best intentions can lead to difficult situations, and that's when we get to practice grace and understanding with each other." Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly at Jonathan's response. "This is exactly what healthy dialogue looks like," she said to the small crowd that had gathered. "Instead of demanding rights or creating conflict, this gentleman is creating space for everyone to learn and grow together. It's a masterclass in how to handle disagreement with dignity." Her academic perspective added weight to Jonathan's approach. "Buy vitamins and supplement." The young mother at the nearby table stood up and walked over, her children following closely behind. "Excuse me," she said to Jonathan, "but I want to thank you for how you're handling this. My kids are watching and they're learning something important about how to treat people with respect, even when there's a problem." Her 8-year-old son nodded solemnly, clearly taking in every word. Linda found herself surrounded by voices of support for Jonathan. But instead of feeling attacked, she was beginning to feel something else, conviction about what was right. Sarah watched her manager's face carefully, hoping to see signs that the rigid policy might give way to something more human and compassionate. The moment felt pivotal, as if everyone in the cafe was holding their breath. "You know what?" Linda said slowly, her voice softer than it had been throughout the entire encounter. "I think I may have made an error in judgment here." The admission seemed to cost her something, but it also seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders. "When I implemented this policy, I thought I was protecting people from feeling uncomfortable. But maybe I was creating the exact opposite of what I intended." Jonathan's face lit up with genuine warmth at Linda's words. "It takes real courage to reconsider a position, especially in front of other people," he said. "That tells me everything I need to know about your character and your heart. You genuinely care about creating a welcoming space. That's beautiful, even if we disagree about the methods." His response was gracious without being condescending. Sarah beamed with pride at her manager's willingness to acknowledge the mistake. "Mrs. Patterson, that's exactly the kind of leadership that makes me proud to work here," she said. "And Mr. Roumie, would you still like that coffee? It would be my honor to make it for you." The offer was simple, but carried the weight of restored dignity and genuine hospitality. The elderly gentleman raised his coffee cup in a small salute. "Now that's what I call good management," he said to Linda with approval. "Takes a big person to admit when they're wrong and make it right. This cafe just earned my permanent business." His endorsement seemed to validate Linda's decision to reverse her stance on the religious symbol policy. Dr. Martinez pulled out her phone and showed the screen to the small group. "I hope you don't mind, but I've been taking notes about this conversation for my next lecture. This is exactly the kind of real-world example my students need to see." How people with different perspectives can come together and find understanding. Without anyone having to sacrifice their core beliefs, the young mother's children had been listening intently throughout the conversation, and now the 8-year-old spoke up with the directness that only children possess. "Why would wearing a cross make people feel bad?" he asked Jonathan. "My teacher wears one, and she's the nicest person in our school." The innocent question cut to the heart of the matter with stunning simplicity. Jonathan knelt down to the child's level, his expression gentle and patient. "Sometimes, buddy, people have had bad experiences with religion, and symbols can remind them of those hurt feelings, but you're right about your teacher. Wearing a cross doesn't make someone good or bad. It's how we treat other people that really matters." His explanation was simple enough for a child, but profound enough for the adults listening. Linda watched Jonathan's interaction with the child and felt something shift inside her, understanding. Here was a man who had been denied service for his faith symbol, yet he was taking time to teach a child about compassion and understanding. His response to unfair treatment was to create more kindness in the world, not less. The lesson wasn't lost on her. As the crowd began to disperse back to their tables, Sarah approached Jonathan with a fresh cup of coffee. "This one's on the house," she said quietly. "And I want you to know, watching you handle this situation has taught me more about my own faith than years of church services. Thank you for showing us what grace actually looks like in action." Jonathan accepted the coffee gratefully, then did something unexpected. He turned to Linda and extended his hand. "Mrs. Patterson, would you be willing to join me for a few minutes? I'd love to hear more about your vision for this cafe, and maybe share some thoughts about how we might create truly inclusive spaces without asking people to hide who they are." The invitation was genuine and hopeful. Linda hesitated for only a moment before accepting his handshake and taking the seat across from him. "I have to admit," she said, "I'm curious about your perspective. When I saw the cross necklace, I immediately thought about customers who might complain or feel unwelcome. But watching how you've handled this situation, maybe my assumptions were wrong about what inclusion actually means." As they sat together, other customers found excuses to linger in the cafe, sensing that something significant was happening. Sarah busied herself with cleaning tasks that kept her within earshot, while Dr. Martinez openly observed from her table, treating the conversation as a live case study in conflict resolution and interfaith dialogue. "Tell me about your original vision for this place," Jonathan said, genuinely interested in Linda's perspective. As she began to share her hopes for creating a community gathering space, her passion became evident. She spoke about wanting a place where people from all backgrounds could come together, where differences could be celebrated rather than merely tolerated. "That vision is beautiful," Jonathan said when she finished. "And I think we want the same thing, a place where everyone can be authentically themselves while respecting others. Maybe the key isn't eliminating symbols or expressions of faith, but creating an environment where those differences can coexist peacefully." What if diversity included religious diversity, too? Linda nodded slowly as Jonathan's words sank in. "I think I've been so focused on avoiding offense that I forgot about the possibility of authentic acceptance," she admitted, "when I asked you to remove your cross. I was trying to make everyone comfortable by making this space neutral. But maybe true comfort comes from knowing you can be yourself, not from hiding who you are." The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Linda and Jonathan discovering surprising common ground in their desires to create welcoming communities. Sarah listened from behind the counter, amazed at how a situation that had started with exclusion was transforming into a deeper discussion about inclusion, acceptance, and the courage required to live authentically in a diverse world. Dr. Martinez eventually approached their table, unable to contain her academic excitement any longer. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, "but I have to tell you both, this conversation is a perfect example of what we call transformative dialogue in my field. You've moved from positions of opposition to a place of mutual understanding without either of you compromising your core values." Other customers had begun to join the expanding conversation, sharing their own experiences with feeling welcomed or excluded in various public spaces. The elderly gentleman spoke about growing up in a time when religious differences created deep divisions, while the young mother talked about wanting her children to understand that diversity strengthens communities rather than threatening them. As the afternoon wore on, Jonathan realized something remarkable was happening. What had begun as a moment of discrimination was becoming an impromptu community discussion about acceptance, faith, and the courage to bridge differences. The cafe was transforming into exactly the kind of space Linda had originally envisioned. A place where people could come together despite their differences. Sarah had been taking mental notes throughout the conversation and finally spoke up. "Mrs. Patterson, I have an idea. What if we created a community board where people could share what makes them feel welcome? Not just rules about what not to do, but positive examples of inclusion and acceptance. Mr. Roumie's example today could be our first story." Linda's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "Sarah, that's brilliant. Instead of focusing on what might offend people, we could celebrate what brings people together." She turned to Jonathan. "Would you be willing to help us launch something like that? Your experience today, both the challenge and how you responded to it, could help other people learn how to handle difficult situations with grace." Jonathan smiled, recognizing how God often used difficult moments to create unexpected opportunities for growth and connection. "I'd be honored to help," he said. "But I think the real story here isn't about me or my cross necklace. It's about how quickly hearts can change when people choose to listen to each other rather than simply defending their positions." The elderly gentleman raised his coffee cup again, this time in a toast to second chances and open hearts. He declared, "I came in here for coffee and got a lesson in how to be a better human being." His words drew smiles from everyone in the growing circle of conversation, creating a moment of shared appreciation for the unexpected turn the afternoon had taken. As the formal conversation began to wind down, Jonathan noticed that the atmosphere in the entire cafe had shifted. Where there had been tension and awkwardness, there was now warmth and connection. Strangers were talking to each other, sharing stories and perspectives they might never have exchanged under normal circumstances. The cross necklace incident had become a catalyst for genuine community building. Linda stood up and addressed the cafe as a whole. "I want everyone to know that today taught me something important about what real inclusion looks like. Going forward, Cornerstone Cafe will be a place where people can express their authentic selves, including their faith, as long as they treat others with the same respect they want to receive." Her announcement was met with spontaneous applause. Sarah immediately began planning the community board Linda had approved. Her enthusiasm infectious as she described how customers could share stories of kindness, inclusion, and moments when someone's differences had enriched rather than divided. "And Mr. Roumie," she added, "we'd love to have your autograph for our first display, not because you're famous, but because of how you handled today." Dr. Martinez gathered her things to leave, but stopped by Jonathan's table one more time. "I'm going to use today's events in my next lecture," she said, "with your permission. Of course, my students need to see that real change happens not through protests or arguments, but through the kind of patient, graceful dialogue you demonstrated here." "Thank you for that gift." As other customers began to leave, many stopped by Jonathan's table to thank him or share how his example had affected them. The young mother's son approached Shilly and asked if he could touch the cross necklace, his childish curiosity about the symbol that had caused such discussion, both innocent and profound. Jonathan knelt down and let the boy examine the simple pendant. "It's not magic or anything," Jonathan explained to the child. "It just reminds me to try to love people the way Jesus did, even when they're different from me, or when they don't understand me. Sometimes, especially then." The boy nodded solemnly, processing this explanation with the seriousness that children bring to important matters, then hugged Jonathan spontaneously before returning to his mother. Linda found herself reflecting on how quickly her certainty about the religious symbol policy had crumbled when faced with Jonathan's grace-filled response. She had expected anger, demands, or threats. Instead, she had encountered patience, understanding, and a willingness to engage in dialogue. The contrast had forced her to examine not just her policy, but her assumptions about how people of faith would react to discrimination. As the cafe began to empty with the end of the afternoon rush, Sarah approached Jonathan with a special request. "My grandmother is never going to believe I met you," she said. "The Chosen has been such a comfort to her, especially since my grandfather passed away. Would you mind if I called her just to say hello? She'd be so thrilled to hear your voice." Jonathan's face lit up with genuine joy at the request. "I would love to talk with your grandmother," he said. "The people who watch The Chosen are the reason we get to tell these stories. They're not just viewers, they're part of our family." Sarah immediately pulled out her phone, her excitement bubbling over as she dialed her grandmother's number with trembling fingers. The phone call with Sarah's grandmother became another unexpected moment of grace. Through the speaker, everyone could hear the elderly woman's voice break with emotion as she recognized Jonathan's voice. She shared how the Chosen had helped her through her darkest days, giving her hope and renewing her faith when everything seemed lost. Jonathan listened with the full attention he gave every person he encountered. "Mrs. Chen," Jonathan said to Sarah's grandmother, "your granddaughter showed more courage today than most adults ever display. She stood up for what was right when it would have been easier to stay quiet. You should be very proud of the young woman you've helped raise." Sarah wiped away tears as her grandmother expressed her gratitude for both the call and the kind words about her granddaughter. As the call ended, Linda realized she was witnessing something profound about the ripple effects of kindness. Jonathan's gracious response to discrimination hadn't just changed the cafe's policy. It had created connections between strangers, inspired a young employee to stand up for her values, and brought joy to an elderly woman hundreds of miles away. One small act of grace was multiplying in ways none of them could have anticipated. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the cafe windows when Linda made an announcement that surprised everyone remaining in the space. "I want to do something," she said, her voice carrying new conviction. "Mr. Roumie, you turned what could have been an ugly confrontation into something beautiful. I want to make sure that kind of transformation continues to happen here." She walked to the community board Sarah had begun setting up near the entrance. "From now on," Linda continued, addressing the few remaining customers, "this board will feature stories of how differences brought people together rather than driving them apart. And Mr. Roumie, I want your story to be our first one. Not about what happened to you, but about how you chose to respond. Your example of grace under pressure is exactly what this community needs to see." Jonathan stood up, his hand instinctively moving to his cross necklace, the same gesture that had started the entire encounter. But now, instead of being a symbol of exclusion, it had become a reminder of how faith could bridge divides rather than create them. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, "what happened here today wasn't about my response. It was about your willingness to listen and change. That takes real courage." Sarah had been setting up the community board while listening to their conversation, and now she stepped forward with a marker and a blank index card. "Why don't you both write the first entry together?" she suggested. "The story isn't really about either of you individually. It's about what happens when people choose understanding over conflict. That's what the community needs to hear." Linda and Jonathan exchanged glances, both recognizing the wisdom in Sarah's suggestion.